Hey Underdogs, welcome back to Underdogs Rise, the podcast where we rise together. We all have a place to go back to. An emotional home. An emotional place, a familiar feeling. A state in our mind which we return to, often without even realising it. For some of us, that emotional home feels like peace. And for others, it may feel like worry, anxiety, criticism, and self-doubt. And yet the remarkable thing is that emotional home that we return to, it was built through a process. And because it was built through a process, it can be rebuilt through a process too. Think of your own home that you live in now. Imagine that. You know where everything is. You don't need directions to navigate that because you've been there so many times. And our emotions and how they live within us act in most familiar ways. Because of those emotions that we experience repeatedly, they become our familiar landscape. If you're like myself, who has spent years worrying, that can feel normal. To feel anxious, to have the self-doubt and the fear. If you've also spent your years criticising yourself, that same self-criticism can start to feel like truth itself. But if you've spent years believing in yourself, confidence can feel natural. Because our mind is wired for familiarity. Simply because it's known, anything that becomes unknown will trigger it. And those same feelings that we try to avoid, they arise. Like none of us wake up one morning and decide to build our emotional home around fear, our doubt, or scarcity or insecurity. These places are often formed slowly. One experience after another, one belief after another. Maybe someone in your own life told you that you weren't good enough, or you start to tell that yourself. And over time, those thoughts became actual beliefs. And those beliefs became our habits. And those habits ultimately, they became our identity. And that identity which became our emotional home. Not because it was true, but because it was repeated. And our minds learn through repetition. What we repeatedly think becomes becomes easier for us to access it. And when we walk enough times, it becomes the clearest thing for us to do. Because you could ignore it for long enough, and eventually our nature, our human nature, begins to reclaim it. But the great news is, here's where hope enters. If that repetition built that path, then the same repetition can create a new one. And this isn't about pretending that it's not there. It is understanding that our brain is malleable. It's got nothing to do with age. Because our brain is capable of learning throughout our life. The same mechanisms that just created our old emotional patterns can create new ones. And that happens in the same process in which they were formed. That old emotional home may still exist. But you no longer have to live there permanently. You can choose to do that. And so can I. This distinction matters. We can all experience sadness and fear and grief. But the goal isn't to eliminate those painful emotions. The goal is to turn those temporary visitors, those difficult emotions, into not a permanent resident. A difficult day doesn't define a life. All of our emotions are information for us. You can still feel anxious without becoming anxiety itself. You can still encounter that fear that you've experienced all your life without building a home inside of it. And building a new emotional home happens in the same way that where we formed and built the old emotional home. It begins slowly, patiently and consistently, just in the same way as the old one was. One choice at a time, one moment at a time. Ask yourself this: how do you just speak to yourself when no one is listening, when no one is watching? Would you actually speak like that to your friend? How would you encourage them? support them or offer them understanding. You wouldn't force them, would you? Every repeated action, every repeated thought is shaping the formulation of another room. And every repeated act of self-respect, self-worth, self-compassion is building a stronger foundation for you to build another room. Because to change a pattern, we must first have to notice that pattern. To notice where our mind naturally returns to those quiet moments when we are by ourselves. To notice the stories that we tell ourselves, or the assumptions that we make. To notice the emotional dress where you've been living at, and to do that without judgment. Just to observe it. Because that observation leads to awareness, which creates choice. And that's where possibility lies. Many of us have spent years, if not decades, trapped in patterns we never realised that we were actually repeating. But the moment that our awareness arrives, the possibility of change arrives with it. At first, those new emotional habits and thoughts feel unfamiliar. And they trigger that part of the brain which is old. And it is uncomfortable. Because our minds are accustomed to returning to that same old address. Every time in those moments you decide to choose compassion instead of criticism, you are teaching your mind and your body a new home. And a new way of how to get there. And eventually once what did feel unfamiliar does become familiar to you. And it becomes natural. Maybe the deepest truth of all of this is our emotional home doesn't have to be a place where it was inherited from our past. It can be a place in this moment where you intentionally create it. A place built on trust, built on acceptance, built on simply loving yourself. Because we taught ourselves to meet life differently. We all have a place that we naturally return to inside ourselves. Our emotional home. And that home was built over time. But it can be rebuilt. because what created that process of yesterday's patterns can create tomorrow's possibilities. So wherever your emotional home is, maybe today remember you're not condemned to live there forever. You can rebuild brick by brick. And you can create a place for yourself where that feels more aligned to who you are becoming. Because that is one of the most meaningful journeys that you will ever undertake in your life. Underdogs rise, and we rise together.